In this tutorial, you will learn how to deal with exceptions in Python. When an error occurs while running a program, we say that an exception is raised. Python allows us to handle exceptions so that the program does not stop its execution. Let me show you one example of exception handling. Open the calculator from your computer or smartphone and try to divide any number by 0. I'll type 75 divide by 0. What I get is a string saying cannot divide by 0. Let's try to do the same with my simplified calculator. This calculator can only perform multiplication and division. If I try to do the same, divide any number by 0, the application crashes. The difference between the calculator from our smartphones or computers to my application is the fact that they handle this kind of exception and my application does not, and therefore it crashes. We can also try to calculate the root square of a negative number. I'll just type -2 equals, we get -2, and if we just press root square, we get invalid input. Note that that's a different message, therefore that's a new exception handling. And knowing how to handle exceptions is very important, because if you are intending to develop a game or a software, you don't want to jeopardize the user experience. And my goal in this video is to explain to you how to read error message from an exception and how to handle exceptions. In this code, we are just dividing two values. First, we assign a value to a variable called first value and a second value to a variable called second value. Then we just print their division. Our last line of code prints end of script. If we see that line printed in the terminal, it means that our code executed without error. Let's give 5 to second value. If I run that code, notice that we get the result of that division 0.4 and the last line, end of script. But now, if we give 0 to the second value and run that code again, we get that long message here, and that's what we call a traceback. And a traceback is the error message which displays the exception type and the line that calls that exception. And the way you can read that is reading from the bottom to top. First we check what is the type of that exception, and it says 0 division error. It means that we just try to divide a number, in that case a float, by 0. And where did that happen? That happened in line 8, because line 6 and line 7 there is no error because we are just assigning values to variables. Then in line 8 we try to divide a number by 0, and Python cannot do that, therefore it raises an exception. At the moment it raises the exception, the program stops and notes that now we don't have the line 15 printed in the terminal, because the Python interpreter found an error before the line 15 was executed. One way to handle that exception is using a conditional statement. Here we can say if second value is equal to 0, then print, let's print the same thing we had in the calculator, that was cannot divide by 0. Else, in that case, we do the division. Else print first value divided by second value. Let's now run that code again. And we get cannot divide by 0, and the last line of code is also printed. It means that this exception is handled. Let's think about the case where we ask the user to input the data. The user can just type, let's say, 2. Now, if you want to run that code, look, we get another traceback. Why? Because we just used the conditional statement to handle the case where a number is divided by 0. But now we have another issue. What is that? What is the type of that exception? The type is type error. And what does that mean? It says we cannot make operations between float and strings. What if I just change from 2 to, let's say, let's also use 2 but inside a list. Let me just clean that code and run it again. We again get the same type, so type error, and it says, look, I cannot make operations between floats and list. How to solve that? We could include another if statement to handle that case. But imagine how many if statements we would need to add in order to cover all the possibilities. To handle exceptions and avoid our program from crashing, we use the try exception statement. The simplest format of a try exception statement is the following. We type the word try followed by colon. It will define the try block. You should add in this block Python statements which might lead to exceptions. Then we type the word except followed by the exception name, then colon. The exception name is optional, and we see what is the difference between having and not having the exception name in a minute. What you need to understand is that the except block will only be executed in case an exception is raised in the try block. Let's handle the previous exceptions and you understand how it works. Let's check again what we get when trying to divide a number by 0. The type of this exception is zero division error, and that's the information we want to add to the except block. Then how to deal with that exception? We just type try, colon. If I press enter, note that we are indented. It means that we just start a new block. That's the command that might lead to an exception. What if that leads to an exception? Then we type except, and after the except, you write the type of that exception. In that case, zero division error. We just add colon, and that block will just be executed in case statements inside the try block leads to an exception. In that case, I will say print. Let's type the same message we saw in the calculator, which was cannot divide by 0. What's going to happen if I run that code? And look, we no longer have an error. There is no exception being raised. What we get is a message saying cannot divide by 0, then the last line or the line 19 is still executed, and then we get end of script. And this is the proper way to deal with exceptions in Python. Now, let's try to assign to that second value another data type. Before I wrote 2, then let's take 2 again. If I run it, and we get another exception. Now, the type is no longer zero division error, but type error. When writing the exception part, you can either have the exception name or not. When add the exception name, we are being specific. We say, in case we get this kind of exception, we're gonna treat it like that. Now, our exception is a different one. It says type error. It means that if I want to also deal with that exception, we need to add another except block. And then we say except, and this is again the type of the exception we want to deal with. And that case is type error, and in that case we can write something else. Let's say cannot mix data types. Let's run that code again. If I run it, we get cannot mix data types, then end of script. Perfect, we just dealt with two different exceptions. Do you remember the calculator example? And I showed that if you try to calculate a root square of a negative number, we get invalid input. And if you try to divide a number by 0, we get cannot divide by 0. And that's very similar to what we are doing here. For each kind of exception, we have a different treatment. There is a second way to deal with exceptions. In that case, you are not specific for each exception, but you are very general. Let me show you. I will just comment those lines. And here we type try. Then what we want to try, that's the same. We want to divide the first number by the second one. If that statement leads to an exception, we say except. And here we no longer give a specific exception. We just type exception. Then colon. Now, when it finds an exception or when it catches an exception, you can print something. I will say print something went wrong. And then you get something went wrong and end of script. Note that we don't have the information of what happened. Which kind of exception is this one? What we can do, after the exception, we can type as message. And what is that? Here we are saying, take the error message and assign that to a variable called msg, which I'm calling message. Now, I will no longer print something went wrong, but message. Let's run that code again. Now we have the information about the exception. we see that we cannot make calculations between float and strings. Alright, what if you want to give 0 again? Save it. We get float division by 0. Question, from where are we taking that? If you remember, let me just comment those lines. And here, just print that line and run it again. Look that message here, float division by 0. That's the same as you see here. And that's how you can get the message from the exception and print to the terminal. What is the drawback of using that general way of handling exceptions? And the drawback is clear, you cannot handle each exception individually. A very good idea is to mix them. Very often we want to be specific to some exceptions, but not that specific to all of the exceptions, right? In that case, what we can do, let me just call it our third case. That's going to be my mixed exception handling. I will comment this one. We are going to take the specific exception handling, paste it here, uncomment, and this we just saw, we are handling the 0 division, the type error, but for all the rest, what we can do, let's just take the general one. Perfect. What we are seeing here, inside the try block, we add the comment that might lead to an exception. If the type of this exception is 0 division error, we print cannot divide by 0. But if the type is type error, then we print cannot mix data types. For all the other exceptions, we will not have a tailored message, but we are going to print the standard one. How to test that code? Let's just try first 0. Run it, we get cannot divide by 0. Now let's assign to the second value a tuple. Run that code. We get cannot mix data type because the type of that exception is type error. Now let's raise a different type of exception. Second value is a tuple. What we can do, let's try to access the third element of that tuple. There are just 2. Then we're gonna have an exception. Then we say second value. Indexing in Python starts with 0, therefore the first element is 0, the second element is 1, then I'm gonna type 2, and I'm pretty sure it's gonna raise an exception. Let's run it. Now we get tuple index out of range, and who is taking care of that? It's not that block, neither this one, it's the general one, and that's a very good idea. You want to be specific to some exceptions, you do that. If you're not, you just type a general exception handling. And do you remember my base calculator that can only multiply and divide? Now, I can divide by 0 and my application does not crash. Why? Because I just applied the technique I showed in that video. And don't forget, inside the try block, only add Python statements that might lead to exceptions. And that's it. I hope you enjoyed and learned something in that video. If you find that content useful, let me know in the comment section what else you'd like to learn. Thanks for watching.